This is the real life. A man spends all his savings to get a taste of what it's like to be a member of a big family. He spent all his savings to buy a deserted 100-year-old castle and 20,000 hectares of land around it. He spent 3 years transforming it into his dream home, even though the castle looks very dilapidated on the outside. But when you walk inside, it's not as bad as the outside. A big job in the 20th century, but thanks to the solidity of the walls, the whole structure was preserved. Nick also found a dry well near the castle. Not only was it responsible for bringing water to the castle, it was connected to a forest swimming pool, although it was in a state of disrepair. But Nick could still see the splendor of the past, and according to the landlord, that the castle served as a shelter during the Second World War and protected hundreds of children. To bring the castle back to life, Nick needed to remove the surrounding trees with an oil rig. As the view widened, he accidentally discovered the door to the basement. Suddenly, there was a whole floor to use. Nick didn't have time to celebrate. He went back to cutting, and then he had to put together a haystack and clean up the weeds that had grown so wild. The steps were cleared of weeds and moss, though only an empty shell remained. Nick wasn't going to take the easier option of knocking it down and rebuilding it. He wanted to restore the castle to as close to its original form as possible and turn it back into a magnificent structure. After all, he did have a few superpowers. The next day, Nick was ready to explore the basement he found yesterday. To give himself some courage, he brought in his 2 young children, and then he had the courage to go underground. But he didn't realize that it was surprisingly spacious, and it was designed to allow for light and air circulation. Nick guessed that this must be the servants' quarters. There were not only bedrooms and water closets, and a huge fireplace, with pipes running to heat the upstairs bedrooms, to heat the bedrooms upstairs. Thinking that he could experience the feeling of a big house, Nick had some maneuvering to do. But the first order of business was to clear the castle of trees. Nick was afraid to do it himself. Because of all the plants, he had to ask a professional worker to tie up the safety rope, and without a second thought, he climbed the crooked tree in the center. From the aerial view, inside the castle, it's instantly wider. It's a lot tidier, considering that it's easier to clean up after the tree dries out. Nick removed all the window frames to make the castle perfect. He'll need to deliver the frames to a friend's workshop beforehand. Nick will spend a lot of time doing a one-to-one restoration to make the windows look the same as they did 100 years ago. The next day, Nick got a wheelbarrow and started cleaning out the basement. What he didn't expect was, after removing the collapsed building materials, he could still see the 100-year-old tiles that had been preserved, and the thought of saving money on remodeling. Nick was instantly energized. Considering the trees, that made it difficult for the construction crews to get in and out. Nick spent 2.5 months cutting up the surrounding logs to make sure the road was clear for traffic. But while working on it, he accidentally found a 156-year-old purple mountain tree. Nick immediately decided to detour all roads in his favor. He didn't even want to throw away the pruned branches. He dug a deep hole in front of the entrance and carefully planted the trunk, just in time for Christmas. The fog of late fall covered everything, but Nick could see a bright future. He'd be living in a clean hand-remodeled home. He'd bring his family to live in a castle that he'd remodeled with his own hands. And so, on a snowy day when it was a few dozen degrees below zero, Nick didn't stop. He was busy cutting the branches of the trees that were piled with snow, so that the branches underneath wouldn't block the construction trucks. With the cleanup work coming to an end, the next step is to move on to the interior of the house. I'm sure with Nick's mobility, he'll be able to bring this place back to life in no time.